started covering chapters 1 and 2 and noticed that I changed my tone of voice. I changed the way I speak. Now that I turned on the camera and I'm talking to the microphone, I'm talking to the same people. We just went very briefly over some of the observations that the students here present have been making about how they speak differently, how their speech changes in different slightly different speech situations. And I welcome everybody, also you who are watching this now, this video, to make those observations along the way during your days. And the ones who are here, continue to make those, and you will notice that there is a lot that we do with language. We do things with language, and language does things to us. So we sometimes get into trouble by the way we speak, and sometimes we hopefully then get out of the trouble by the way we speak after we have gotten into trouble. So it's a very powerful means of interaction. We can smile, we can do all these kinds of extra linguistic things in order to be friendly, but ultimately a lot boils down to the selection of the style. And the style is not just the tone of voice, it's not just the words chosen, it's the compilation of all those different linguistic markers that we resort to when we speak. So today we've done with the observations, and we're covering chapters 1 and 2 in the textbook today. And I'm going to actually start by reading a little story about just a regular day about a woman's life. This is a woman who has a name. It becomes clear here, but it's interesting. Pay attention to what she says and what is said to her. And think about the answer to the question, why do we say things in different ways? So every afternoon, my friend packs her bag and leaves her San Diego office at about 5. As she leaves, her business partner says, "Goodbye, Margaret." She replies, "Goodbye, Mike." Her secretary says, "Goodbye, Miss Walker." She replies, "Goodbye, Jill." And the janitor says, "Bye, Mrs. Walker," to which she responds, "Goodbye, Andy." As she arrives home, she is greeted by, "Hi, Mom," from her son, Jamie. "Hello, dear, have a good day," from her mother, and simply, "You are late again," from her husband. Later in the evening, the president of the local flower club calls to ask if she would like to join. "Good evening, is that Mrs. Billington?" she asks. "No, it's Miss Walker, but my husband's name is David Billington," she answers. "What can I do for you?" Finally, a friend calls, "Hi, Meg, how's things?" So, what did you notice in this little excerpt of life, a day of the life of by Margaret Walker? So when she leaves, let's take this one situation at a time. As she leaves the office, she says to her partner, "Goodbye, Margaret," or her partner says, "Goodbye, Margaret," and she replies, "Goodbye, Mike." So Margaret and Mike, what does this signify about their relationship?
They're on the same level.
Exactly. Yes, they are on the same level in terms of when you read the chapters, you read quite a bit about the power thing, how that affects how we speak and how we are spoken to. That there's this social construct of power that affects how we use language, and it leads us to choose certain ways of talking to each other, and the address terms. They are very often we could say they correlate with the power situation of the two people. But if somebody calls you Margaret and you call him Mike, then you are on the same level if we call each other with our first names. So then her secretary says to her, "Goodbye, Miss Walker, Miss Walker." And she replies, "Goodbye, Jill." What does this indicate? Yes, exactly. It's this kind of a power situation. She's here and her secretary is here because she's the one who gives she's the boss of the secretary. And there is a clearly defined, professionally defined power differential between them because, she's the one who probably may have even hired her, will give evaluations of her secretary and so on. Decides or is part of the decisions of races and those kinds of things. So the secretary calls her Miss Walker, and she replies with the secretary's first name, showing that she's in charge and in the power position. Then the janitor says, "Bye, Mrs. Walker," and she responds, "Goodbye, Andy." So we have the same situation of power here again. She's some sort of an executive in this job that she has, and Andy is a janitor, and here we come to the social construct of power again, which is somehow encapsulated in the way we address each other. And we will talk more about, and you read a little bit about critical discourse analysis, which kind of invites us to look at these things in order to make it concrete that, hey, why are these people not addressing each other on the equal level? Why do we want to reinforce this kind of a hierarchical system within an institution, for instance, by the way of choosing the address terms? But there's something else here also. The secretary says, "Goodbye, Ms. Walker." And Andy, the custodian, says, "Goodbye, Mrs. Walker." We won't typically even notice that kind of a thing, but it tells something about the secretary who calls Margaret Ms. Walker and the custodian who calls her Mrs. Walker. What does that tell? Or does it tell anything? What's the difference between MS, comma, and MRS? Not comma, but period. Yes?
One's married and one's not.
Say it again.
Mrs. is not married and Miss is not married and Mrs. is married. Correct?
Mrs. is definitely married, yes. And typically, what do we usually use? For an unmarried woman, what is the title for unmarried woman? These are becoming obsolete little by little, but that would be, is that already MISS, Miss? Is that already completely obsolete? Would you call yourselves Miss, whatever your last name is? No? Do you know anyone whom you would call with, the title Miss, which indicates that the woman is unmarried? So Ms. has already become, based on a quick observation here, it has become obsolete. Yes, that's kind of like, I don't see that anymore anywhere. What the initial introduction of MS, it was to fight this notion that by the titles we are dividing women into those who are married and those who are not married. And MS was to take over both the use of the title Miss, MISS, and Mrs. So MS would have covered the ground of both. And it would have been parallel to, what do we call the men? What is their title, corresponding title? Mr. Yes. So has it ever made a distinction between a married man or an unmarried man? No, it hasn't. It doesn't make that distinction. And it was at the time relatively late, 60s, 70s. I don't have exactly the dates down here, so don't quote me on that. But it was relatively late because I remember that MISS was quite prevalently used for women who are not married, and then you get married and you change your title, it becomes Mrs. And you also change your last name, you abandon your father's last name and pick up your husband's last name. And so you've become like a new person, a new title and a new last name. And people who, of course, the men didn't change their titles. And they didn't. It's really good, by the way, to be talking about this to an all-female audience here. So you can relate. But this is not against men. It's against these power structures and linguistic indications of what is going on in society. That, you know, we can look at these tiny little differences in titles for women and men, and we can see a whole world that is reflected in those societal differences. So women started to kind of protest this non-violent ways, and they cut through this idea that let's just abandon the difference between Miss and Mrs. and call everybody MS, Ms., which would be then genuinely corresponding to the Mr. title. But now you are saying that people understand MS to be. Do you all agree that it's for, if you put MS in front of your last name, that's an indication that you are an unmarried woman? You're all nodding. Okay. Yes. Jada, you agree also? Yes. Oh, do you have a comment?
Typically, I would, even if I knew they were married, I would say this anyways, just because it's a personal preference for me. But if they correct me, then I would go ahead and like Mrs.
Yes.
But
yes.
I think we use the Miss instead.
So if you think back into when you were in school, did you use Mrs. as a title for your teachers, or did you use Ms., MS?
Depending on the teacher. Because some of them insisted on Mrs. if they were married. And some
Oh,
of them
they insisted on that. Exactly. Yes. All right. Yes. That is interesting. Even if you use the MS like Ms., of course they're pronounced identically, so the pronunciation doesn't help to make the point here. Yes, but it's an interesting thing. So if Margaret Walker's secretary calls her Miss Walker, MS Walker, and the custodian calls her Mrs. Walker, what does that tell about the secretary and the custodian? Yeah, so that the custodian may be a little bit more conservative socially, and the secretary may know Walker, Miss Walker, Mrs. Walker better, and knows that she's a pretty emancipated woman, and that she would prefer to be called Miss and not Mrs. Yes.
Especially if she's her secretary, she probably takes calls from her husband, so she knows she didn't take her husband's name.
Yeah. That's it. So it's a tiny, tiny difference, but it signals all kinds of little things. She goes home and she says, "Hi, Mom," uses a familial term to her mother. I think most people do, or does anyone call your mother with their first name? Would you? Okay, all right. Well, what does that signify?
Levels of respect would be a little bit.
Okay, yes, very, very cool. Right, what about you?
Well, on another take, sometimes my best friend's mothers, I call them mom as well as like a compliment that's like, you're important to me kind of thing, and I feel safe with you.
Yeah, that's interesting because it changes that address term signals that you consider her as close to you as your mother, and that's a huge compliment, isn't it? Yes. So, well, that's great. She says to her son, "Hello, dear," and the mom says, "Hello, dear, have a good day." So mom calls her dear. Do your mothers call you dear? What are you called? Just by first name?
Like first name or sometimes mama.
Yes.
Mama.
Yes.
Like an intern endearment.
Great. Any other ways of who would call you dear? Darling. Are these obsolete address terms? Sweetheart, who would call you sweetheart?
It sounds more like significant others terms.
Yes. Okay. So nobody calls you a sweetheart? Or a boyfriend even?
If I had one.
My husband calls me all kinds of names. Cutie pie and pumpkin, and he will be so embarrassed. I have told her that sometimes I walk past his office, which is down here on the other side of the hall, and he says, "Hey, pumpkin," loud voice. I tell him, "Here in Evans, you need to call me Dr. Pumpkin." Anyway, but those are interesting, of course those change from time to time, and just pay attention to those things too. What do people call you? Sometimes I am startled if I go to a store here in Huntsville and a person who is checking me out, like a clothing store or something, the time when we could actually go to the stores, reminiscing those times, and they would sometimes say, "Here you are, darling," and I'm like, "Oh, this is so lovely. This is so lovely that this person who doesn't know me and I don't know her calls me a darling." And what does that signify? Is it a local thing?
So I was actually discussing that with my friend last night.
Yes.
How she works at a pizza place. She takes calls.
Yes.
And she was saying how it's really uncomfortable when men call her like sweetheart, or like, she said one called her kiddo. She goes, "But if a woman called me sweetheart or babe, it would be fine." Because
Okay.
it's different power dynamics there.
And yes, because what does that signify? Are we back to the power? The societal power here.
I think it's power and familiarity. So like women
Yes.
understand each other on a level that men and women don't exactly.
Right. And if a man you don't know calls you sweetheart, what does that signify?
It's a little creepy.
Say again?
It's a little creepy.
It's creepy. Yes. Yes, because it's kind of like crossing a line that I'm not your sweetheart. I don't even know you. I'm here to sell you food, right? And we can be polite to each other without being, because it's kind of like borderline condescending, patronizing, flirting, all those things that you wouldn't want to have in a professional encounter. We signal these things by language. Of course, this is probably a little bit of an older man who does that, because there have been, huge changes in how people spoke to women in the 1950s, and he was probably innocently trying to be nice and sweet or whatever. But it becomes, like you say, creepy. When everybody should now know that we have to stay professional and be careful about what we signal with our language. So, any other observations about these kinds of address terms? Yeah, the small things, but they send a lot of messages. So from a woman, it's kind of like endearing in a way, but from a man, it becomes different. Yes, Jade.
I had a older customer, older man, call me almond eyes once. That's when I said they called me almond eyes. I'm like, okay. Yeah, what do you say to that? Like almond eyes. Sir, you could be my grandfather.
Yeah, I'm gonna come closer. So basically, I'm sorry to ask you to repeat.
But he was about, I would say 60.
Yeah.
Called me and he said, thank you, almond eyes. Something like that. Because it's really weird. It's always the older guys.
It's always the older guy. Yeah. Yes. And that's a good example. Yeah. Yes, and it makes you feel weird. It's true.
I've noticed with like older guys, like especially like the elderly kind, they comment more on like physical attributes, like sweet cheeks or skinny thing, and now the kids, like the men our age, don't really do that.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Well, these things have really changed by some explicit boundaries that have been placed in terms of language, and so that people nowadays, they know that you're not supposed to be calling a woman, which you might be thinking it's endearing, but if it comes from an older guy, it sends the wrong messages today, and people are learning these, so you don't hear these from younger guys, right? Yeah. You're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, some guys do, but when they do, it's clear that they're like trying to flirt, and it still comes off as creepy sometimes. But like the majority of guys our age don't use those terms, like just out of nowhere.
Right. So, how do you flirt then? How do you know that somebody's trying to flirt with you if language is off limits?
Usually body language.
Body language? Okay. Another, switching to a different language. Yes.
Probably tone.
Because, I mean, these are things that as human beings, we sometimes want to send these kinds of messages that, you look nice, I would like to get to know you better. But a lot of this is now just because, you have all these legal issues involved there have been so many cases in universities where, guys have gotten in trouble for sometimes for a reason, and sometimes we don't know. But at least, probably a sign of a changing culture here, that women have really put their foot down, that I'm not going to be harassed, and you don't have the right to harass me. And then we end up with a situation where, you know, you have to get to know a person really well before you can say these nice things to them that, you know. Yes.
I've noticed, okay, so sometimes when I see something like nice, I like to comment on it. Like, you know, when you see a girl with her shoes or something, you say, I like her shoes. Well, a couple times I'll say like to like a male customer, or like, I like your hair, or I like your tie, and it's not a profession, it's just I like it, and I want your hair.
Yes.
And they're really excited about that, and I noticed that.
Yes. So people like to get these compliments, right? Yeah. Anything? No?
I think it comes down with the flirting thing. I think it comes down to tone too, and like how you use the words. Because it's one thing to just be like, "Hey, sweetheart," to a girl who's working. It's
Yeah.
another thing to be like, oh, I don't know how to flirt, but like to be like, "Oh, you seem nice. I would like to go out with you sometime." Like, be maybe more formal in that sense, to where it puts you in the place of vulnerability instead of the girl you're asking out, maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yes.
I've noticed it's been a shift. I don't know if it's just because it's like a middle high school thing and like I'm just older now, but I've noticed that when I was in like K through 12 education, it was like, oh, you're a boy, I'm gonna flirt with you, then you'll be my boyfriend, and now it's more like, oh, you're a boy, you're my friend, and then maybe I'll flirt with you. So
Interesting. So we have kind of like added a little step there. Yeah. Well, that's maybe healthy. Yes. Why would you want to be somebody's girlfriend if you're not friends with that person? Yeah, that's interesting. Yes. Jada, did you have something to add? Okay. Well, cool stuff. So, did we have anything else here to discuss? So the husband says, "You're late again," while her mother says, "Hello, do you have a good day?" And the husband says, "You're late again." So, what does that tell about?
Honestly, the guy's really gonna be switched.
Yeah, right. Yes. Well, the mother is the one who seems to be supportive, and maybe the husband is a little bit resentful that this seems to be a woman who has made it in the business world and is doing well and has an actual career. So then the phone call comes in from the flower club, and the woman from the flower club says, "Good evening, is that Mrs. Billington?" And she says, "No, it's Miss Walker. But my husband's name is David Billington." So what do we learn from her at this point about her?
she's kind of assertive.
Yes, she is assertive, and she has made this decision that she's not going to take her husband's last name. She's going to keep her own name, which is her father's name most likely, and she's not going to be called Mrs. because Mrs. signals married woman. She is resorting to this. We're back to this, the neutral Miss, which that would be a really, really interesting study, by the way, which one of you could pick up for your presentation if you want to do like a survey. How do people perceive MS? Does that refer to all women, or does it only refer to unmarried women? So just an idea. So those kinds of things you can start thinking about for the presentation. So she's assertive, and she is of the opinion that women should keep their own names and not make a big deal out of the fact that they are married. So getting married doesn't give you a title. Going to school gives you a title, but getting married is not necessarily what should give you a title. I don't know how you feel about that. How many of you, none of you is married, right? So if you meet that Prince Charming after you become friends with him, and get married, are you gonna give up your last name and take the husband's name?
I think it depends on their last name.
Oh, good
For
point.
starters.
Good point. If it's a good name, take it. Yes. And any Jade?
I saw a post once where this woman who was she had a PhD and she went by doctor her own last name. People were like, why didn't you use your husband's last name? She was like, he didn't get the degree, I did.
Yeah. There's a good point. What about you? I mean, you don't have to decide now. This is not a holding.
I'm gay, so
Yeah.
I won't have a husband. I don't have a wife. So I think that's also interesting with like the whole last name thing and how that.
The last name thing that applies also, with whenever there's a marriage, then you kind of have to decide.
Right. I think I would keep my last name.
So yeah. So it's interesting. So here we have already it's kind of like a microcosm of the entire society, that people make different decisions about this. I myself have been, and it's a difficult decision, because when you are in love, you want to take that person's name as an indication that we have this bonding thing, we even have the same last name. Clearly, Miss Walker didn't think that way. She thought that she has to find other ways to bond with her husband than, taking his name. Women then, have to go through these, name change processes, which typically men don't have to. Nowadays, the laws have changed that you can take the other, your partner's name as well, and that is not very common yet. I don't think it is. The typical thing still is that the woman takes the husband's name. That seems to be, even though it's there is another topic for a presentation. You can do a survey and or a little study and see what kinds of decisions people make. For me personally, it wasn't even an issue when I got married first. It didn't ever even occur to me, and this now we're talking about mid-70s. It was not the thing for women to do then, to keep their father's name. And then that was fine. Then I entered the profession, and all my publications were done under Halmari. And then the second time around, it was really difficult for me to decide what to do. And many men would have insisted that no, you can't keep your first husband's name, and I didn't. I added. I needed to keep it for professional purposes, because it shows in all my publications, and I wouldn't have wanted to go through the starting all over again with a different name, because I wouldn't have been known under the other name. And so I added the other name there and kept my first husband name as my middle name and my professional name, and it causes confusion. So I get mail. It's like I'm this schizophrenic person who gets who goes. One of my passports is under a different last name, and the other one is under a different last name. So I'm like this, double agent in a way. No, I'm not. But it causes, so based on my own experiences, I usually tell my female students, stick to your father's name. It's another man's name, but the husbands may come and go. Your partners may come and go, and your father will always be your father. So just my, but I understand there's a lot of, and that's exactly why I didn't, just stick the second time around, because I have thought this through already, and I still added that new husband's name to my official name. So yeah.
How often is it that people will hyphenate the names? That's something that's an option too.
Yeah, that's a compromise. It's a compromise. You keep your maiden name, and then add another name and use that as hyphenated. Of course, in different cultures, like for instance in the South American, Central American, Spanish cultures, people have two last names because what is the basis for that? Everybody has two last names.
Don't they keep both last names?
They take one from father and one from mother. So you have a lot of these. Still, when then you have children, they go through the same process. So within the same families, you have these dual last names often. And very often people, just drop the second one. But anyway, those are interesting things, and that is why I'm talking about it so long here, is because that is such a concrete language-related thing that kind of frames a lot of our worldview and our relationship to our loved ones and so on. But you do whatever feels best. This is just like my personal musings. So anyway, so she insists that she is Miss Walker, but her husband's name is David Billington. And then her friend calls, and the friend calls, "Hi Meg, how's things?" What does Meg signify instead of Margaret that her business partner called her? Yeah. These people know each other well. This is a friend, not a business related, more informal, right? Do you have pet names? Yeah. And it's only certain people who call you with those pet names. Yeah. Right. Yes. Cool. Any other observations here? So what we have been talking about is a really, really restricted area. How we say hello to a person, what address terms we use. And we'll come back to this when we talk more about power in language, because these often show power and solidarity as well. Okay. Let's move on to kind of like talk about this knowledge of language. We talked about it a little bit last time already, and knowledge of language is your linguistic competence. We did talk about that and the different sub-areas of language where you have competence. So you can pronounce the sounds, you understand the system of sounds, you understand the smallest units of meaning, which are the morphemes of which we build words, of which we build sentences and phrases, and that's the area of syntax already, and semantics, the area of meaning of words and sentences and phrases. So knowledge in these 5 areas of linguistics: phonology, phonetics, morphology, syntax, and semantics. It makes it possible to speak a language, we have to have knowledge and competence in those areas. When you are learning a foreign language, you have to learn the sounds, the system of sounds, which distinctions are meaningful in a sentence, which sounds have the power of changing the meaning of the word, for instance, from gate to hate, to date, to mate, to late, and so on. So changing the first sound there changes the meaning of the word. That's the sound system, and you have to know the morphology. If you've studied, like for instance, Spanish, you have to know the verb forms, what the endings of the verbs need to be with particular subject, for instance, and you need to use those grammatically correct forms in order to sound grammatical in that language. You have to know meanings of words, and you will understand meanings of sentences. So this is the so-called linguistic competence. Your competence in those 5 so-called core areas of language. But as we mentioned last time, and this is a little bit of kind of like going over what we already introduced last time. But besides those 5 core areas of language, which we need to have competence in order to speak the language, we also need to know how to use the language in society. And that's when we enter into the areas of sociolinguistics, and the fact that you know the meanings of Miss and Mrs. and Mr. and so on and so forth doesn't help you to select the correct address term to a person based on your relationship and the societal expectations in a particular situation. So you still know how to do it, and that is called communicative competence. So we have linguistic competence, which is kind of like the prerequisite for speaking a language, but then in order to communicate in that language that we have competence in, we need to have communicative competence. Communicative competence is tricky in the sense that it varies from culture to culture. And a culture here doesn't necessarily mean a different, you go to a different country and the linguistic habits are different. It means that even within our own country, we have a lot of subcultures, and that means that you kind of need to know how to navigate verbally in those different situations where you find yourself. So communicative competence is very, very important. The term linguistic competence was introduced by Noam Chomsky. And he has been revolutionary for modern linguistics. So Noam Chomsky introduced these terms competence versus performance, and what he underscored about linguistic competence is that our linguistic competence as native speakers is complete. It means that whatever dialect, whatever variety of language you learn from childhood, your competence in that variety is complete. And that's sometimes referred to endearingly as the gift of language, that we have gotten this language as a gift, and we kind of, you don't remember that it was difficult to learn English when you were toddlers. you were given that gift. Of course, it's hard for a little kid also. It requires a lot of attention, and it's all pretty much subconscious. But it seems that language just emerges. If you have younger siblings or cousins who are 1, 2, and 3 years old, you can see how they are absorbing this language without any evident effort, but they pay a lot of attention. The little brains are doing a lot of work when they are learning the language. So it is not effortless on the part of the child, but it's a lot of that is subconscious also, and they learn that linguistic competence. Now, Chomsky made the distinction between competence and performance, linguistic performance. Linguistic competence is complete. It's 100% for all native speakers. Obviously, that means that when we talk about 100% linguistic competence in your first varieties of language, it doesn't mean that you wouldn't be learning more about the language later on. So some people have larger vocabularies. You studied for your school SATs using those little cards, and some people studied harder and learned more words. It doesn't mean that their linguistic competence is bigger or more complete than yours. Everyone's linguistic competence is complete. It's this wonderful gift that we've gotten. And we can use that language, our first varieties, effortlessly. If you compare using a foreign language that you have studied later on in school, it's much harder. You're very conscious about, oh my goodness, what is the ending of this verb in Spanish that I need to use in this particular sentence. So it becomes conscious, but linguistic competence in our first languages is complete. It also doesn't mean, I want to emphasize that whatever variety, if it's a non-standard variety that is your first variety or a person's first variety, they have complete competence in that variety too. So this doesn't bring in the prescriptive notion that you don't know a language, you are not a competent language user if you use, for instance, double negatives, or if you use ain't, or if you end sentences with prepositions, and so on and so forth. These are artificial rules of standard language, and that's not part of a native speaker's linguistic competence. Does that make sense? Yes. So it's kind of like, it's kind of a relief to know that we have like license to believe that everyone's linguistic competence is complete in their first dialects. So I think it's a cool thing. Another thing is, of course, that when you come to school, when you go to university, you need to learn the rules of the so-called standard varieties, and we'll speak more about that and why we need to learn the rules of the standard varieties is just based on societal power issues again. That's where we come back again, that there is this one variety that has been kind of like artificially lifted above everything else, standard American English in this country, and that's why students have to take freshman composition so that they can learn academic written English, which is done in standard American English. And if you write in a composition, if you include double negatives or what have you, you'll probably get comments back that, or a bad grade. And that's a different thing because what in those classes students are taught is like a different language. It's like if you're if you don't come from a background where a lot of people in your family, for instance, use something that is close to standard. Now, nobody really speaks standard all the time. We reserve that mostly for writing, but it's still this, this abstract artificial variety that has been put on a pedestal for everybody to try to aspire to, at least in certain situations. But as I mentioned last time, there are situations where it's not the proper choice. When, for instance, we are chatting with our friends informally, then it's probably not good to speak like a book, right? So linguistic competence and communicative competence, yeah. The trick with communicative competence is that it is culturally defined. In different cultures, there are different expectations for how we communicate. And if we move from the area of language to body language, if you just think about the different cultures, how people greet each other, do you hug? Do you shake hands? Do you just stand apart? So do you have observations about the cultural differences? And these can be cultural differences even from family to family. I have some family members who are huggers, and then there are the non-huggers. So, you go to somebody's birthday, and of course now you don't hug anybody because we have to keep the 6-foot distance, and that has been difficult for some people who are very you hug and kiss your grandchildren and your close friends, and now you can't. So it feels like you are restrained from doing the normal thing, because your communicative competence in those situations is calling for a hug and perhaps a kiss on the cheek or what have you. And then in some cultures where I come from, we shake hands a lot. Of course, you have to do the elbow shake hands nowadays. But in my culture, you always extend your hand and you shake hands with people you haven't met. There's more hugging in my culture now than there used to be. But I also come from these two different cultural straits. In the eastern parts of Finland there are more huggers, and then at least when I was growing up, and then the western parts of Finland there are fewer huggers. You kind of always figured, these are my mom's relatives, so we don't hug so much, and these are my dad's relatives. So those things change over time also. Do you have any observations about that? Like pre-COVID times, who would you typically hug, like at a party? Mm-hmm.
Normally, at least in my experience, it's kind of like expected to hug when you're saying goodbye, unless you're in like a very professional setting like school or work.
Yes.
But if you're like at a party and you meet people, you would hug them goodbye, even if you don't really know them.
Yes, right. And if you don't do it, it's kind of like sending a different kind of because that's part of the communicative competence. Any other?
I was talking to a friend of mine about this like a week ago, and I think it's like also like an age thing.
Yes.
You were saying how weirdly that I feel more comfortable hugging and touching my friends when it turns to greeting versus my parents. And I found that a lot of people are like that when it comes to family. We're like, oh, don't touch me. But when it's like friends, I'm like, oh, hey.
Yes, interesting. So it depends on the relationship. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So
Yes.
I am not a hugger. There are 3 people I willingly hug, like besides just a quick hi or bye, and that is my best friend, my sister, and my grandmother. That's
Okay.
it.
Yes.
Like sometimes like my dad, but even then like it's just like a quick hug usually. Just
Yeah,
hi or
it's
bye.
kind of like they're
Whereas-
there.
Yeah, whereas my sister or my grandmother or my best friend, I'll come behind and hug them or whatever.
Yeah.
Even my close friends who are my roommates, they love hugging, and I'm like, no. No
Yes.
hugs, please. Too much.
Are you a hugger or not? Yes. Yeah. Right. So that body language is also, what kind of body language we use in particular situations that may vary. I remember I after moving to this country, I noticed, and this may have changed, but because I come from the handshaking culture, so at parties or meetings or whatever, I often extended my hand to men, and that I didn't know, and then part of that is you say your name, you expect them to say their name, and you don't necessarily wait for anyone to introduce you, but you can be introduced, but that handshake is like part of my culture. And I was snubbed a couple of times that the man in a meeting wouldn't shake my hand, and I mean this is like 20 years ago, so this may not happen again, but explicitly said that I don't shake a woman's hand. I'm like, excuse me. But it kind of made me realize that there are cultural differences. There truly are cultural differences. Now there are religions where men are not supposed to be shaking a woman's hand, and I've been told that too. That a graduate student of mine said I'm not supposed to be shaking the hand of a woman, but I will make an exception with my professor. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I didn't want you to, cross any cultural boundaries here. I'm just, automatically shaking your hand when you are leaving for your PhD program. And so there are these really kind of striking cultural differences. They are not striking until you encounter a situation where cultures do different things. So anyway, so that's just the body language, but as we talked about these title terms, that is part of our knowing how to address a person is part of communicative competence, and we tend to learn that communicative competence when we grow within a culture. We observe how things are done. What do grandma and aunt do in these situations, and we just model that without really paying much attention to it, and that's how we become communicatively competent members of our cultures. Sometimes when you enter new subculture within a culture, you kind of have to explicitly learn. In freshman composition, I think a lot of the instructors are including a little segment about how to address your professor in an email. That first of all, you have to find out what the person's title is. Is it Ms.? Do they perhaps prefer Mrs.? Or do they prefer professor or doctor, and so on? And because that is the opening of the email, and it sends the wrong message if you call a person Mrs. and that happens to be, like our example, emancipated woman. People work hard to get their doctorates and to get professorships at universities, so they pretty much tend to like to be called doctors or professors. And of course, people's opinions about that, how strongly they feel about that, it varies. Part of that email culture and learning it in the college email culture is also, like, you introduce yourself and you remind the person of what class you are from. yesterday. It wasn't anybody from this class, obviously, but I got an email from a student saying I can come to class tomorrow, and she had a specific question. I'm like, I wonder which class she's from, because I teach 3 different classes and have dozens of students. So, we sometimes teach these things which are part of communicative competence, but most often we learn these subconsciously, just by growing up in the culture. It's another gift that we get, a language gift. Okay, Worthian hypotheses. And this is kind of talked about or around this thing when we talk about, like, for instance, the changes from Mrs. and Ms. Mrs. and Miss to MS. We're trying to do something with the language. We'll talk more about that. But we have only 3 minutes left, right? Yeah, 5 minutes, yes. Yes, so let's talk about directions. We'll come back to Worthian hypotheses next time. And all of these topics, correlations and research methods, they're covered in your readings. So, so kind of like look over those. Language versus dialect, we will definitely talk more about. But the directions of influence, and this is in a class of sociolinguistics, we need to kind of address this. What is the relationship between language and society? Which way does that relationship, if there are influences that happen from language to society or from society to language, what is the direction of that influence? So the first option, there are 4 options. So the first option is that social structure may either influence or determine linguistic structure or behavior. Social structure. The kind of society we live in, social classes, different genders, all kinds of different groups of people. So social structure, the power structure included, may either influence or even determine linguistic, that's how I abbreviate linguistic structure or behavior. Let's just put these 4 options here. So that society influences language. What kind of society we have influences how we speak. But it can go the other way around, that linguistic structure, kind of language we use, linguistic structure and or behavior may either influence or determine even social structure. And this is the Worthian hypothesis, which you have read about, that people are somehow as if they were prisoners of their own languages, that they cannot talk about certain things if there are in that language, or they have a harder time talking about certain concepts if their language doesn't, for instance, include words for those concepts. Or if the language makes categories of social structure, then people are kind of like seeing that social structure. So, do you see how that works? Okay. So the third possibility is that, we need to probably, language and society, I'll just quickly write this down, may influence each other. And the last one, there is no relationship. At all between linguistic structure and social structure. Each is independent of the other. Okay. 4 possibilities. These are logical possibilities. I want you to think about, these are also in your book, and I want you to think about by next time, think about the your opinion of these. Which one is the most likely option, and perhaps give examples of society influencing language and language influencing society, or both influencing each other. So try to think about concrete examples of those. And enjoy the rest of the week. Good seeing you. Thank you for all your input.